Greetings. I'm Arya Dipawijana of Universitas. On this occasion, I would like to deliver my presentation entitled Contagion and Virality. This is a part of an ongoing research project on the advent of digital culture, particularly in Indonesia, as well as the global world in general. And at the same time, it is a part of my long-standing research interest in post-colonial studies, which I view as a study of how the trajectory of history of development of the global economy has contributed to a globally shared imagination of the interconnectedness of human lives despite geographic distances and temporal gaps. The idea of contagion in such a world is of course very central, as it denotes how varied human experiences separated by distances may touch and come into contact with each other by the establishment of trade routes and transportation infrastructures, land, sea, and air, designed to facilitate the free movement of capital, resources, and people for the sake of global trade. In its development, it has also served as the avenues by which the ideas and imagination are disseminated, as the publishing industry has been one of the industries that has taken advantage mostly of this global transportation network, bringing stories, poetry, and other forms of writing from one part of the world to another. This opening of paths of encounter, which has been both economically and politically advantageous to most significantly Europeans since the 16th century, has also caused fear of contact or contagion. Narratives of disease and unhygienic conditions threatening the very core of civilization have also spread with the literature through publishing markets. Today, the spread of such narratives is exacerbated by the digital technology and the internet, and not to mention the COVID-19 pandemic, which we have yet to overcome. Today, the same global network that have well served trade and industry, as well as the dissemination of knowledge and the meeting of cultures, have also become pathways by which deadly viruses travel from one geographic area to another. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the global economy without colonialism and the transnational conquest of nations, pandemics would not have come to be. And the narratives of disease have also traveled through the same avenues, thus creating also a globally shared feeling of unease. With the advent of the internet, this feeling of unease has also become as viral as the diseases themselves. While on a previous occasion I have spoken about the impact of the present pandemic on literary trends by comparing it to the way the Spanish flu in the beginning of the 20th century had helped to fashion the themes and motifs of the modernist and existentialist literature, at present I would like to focus on three narratives of different historical periods, namely Thomas Harriot's A Brief and True Report of the Newfoundland of Virginia, initially published in 1588, uh, representing the time when England had just begun to establish itself as a global economic and political power, representing also the early modern period which gave birth to modern colonialism as we understand it. And the second one is Arthur Conan Doyle's short story, The Crooked Man, first published in 1893, representing the historical period as the height of the British Empire as well as the moment of transition into modernism, and also what we understand as 20th century modernity. And the third, finally, is Ali Smith's Summer, published just last year in the midst of the current pandemic, representing, of course, our own time. There have been ample amount of studies of diseases and contagion with literature and how they overlap with literature and culture. There is Christensen's book of 2005, 19th Century Narratives of Contagion, the collection edited by Batchelor and Hooker, published by Routledge, as also Christensen, and Price Smith's book, published by MIT Press. And then we have Mann's book, just published in 2018, published by the University of Virginia Press, and also Carlin's edited book in 2005, published by Palgrave Macmillan, and the article by Davis in the American Literary History Journal. There's also Harris's article of 2003 in Victorian Literature and Culture, and Pernick's article of 2002 in the American Literary History. And finally, there's Willis's article of 2007, published in the Studies of the Novel. And finally, the most what I think is a very important theoretical work by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, Empire, published in 2000 by Harvard University Press, which had initially directed my attention to the connection between empire, that is the global economy, contagion, and literature. These pieces, which I have just mentioned and shown on the screen, discuss the overlap and intertwining between the fear of imagined contagion and political as well as economic colonization, and how the ideas spread through literature and the publishing market, each focusing on the periods of the text that I'm discussing now in my presentation. The first book that the first piece that I'm talking about is Harriet's 16th century piece, which is basically a treatise written to encourage political policymakers in the British Parliament, investors, and the potential workforce of the time to support the enterprise of establishing plantations and colonies in the New World, which would boost the economy of Elizabethan England. The Virginia Company, which was later chartered, became one of the companies which brought about British colonialism, particularly in the Americas, and as well as to various parts of the world, including the so-called Honorable East India Company, chartered in 1600, after which in 1601 the Dutch counterpart and rival VOC was then established also. This piece by Harriet describes the potentials of the natural resources and landscape of Virginia, while at the same time also anticipates the resistance of the indigenous population against England's economic enterprise. It describes the local population as being docile and welcoming of the English. And one passage which is of particular interest to the topic that I'm addressing today is the one that narrates the introduction of smallpox to the native Algonquin people who had never been exposed to the viral disease. As Stephen Greenblatt explains in his seminal essay Invisible Bullets, the narrative serves as a justification for conquest, as the narrative argues that the local people themselves see their exposure and subsequent infection of the viral disease as proof of the superiority of the English, as the former seems to have no ability to suffer the attacks of the invisible bullets, i.e. the virus. And thus, in the very beginning of the onset of modern colonialism, contagion and disease are already crucial factors in the success of conquest, which is quite a contrast also to other colonial narratives which describe European invaders as being stricken by tropical diseases such as malaria, thus also demonstrating the superiority of England not only over the colonized population but also over other colonizing powers of the previous era, such as the Spanish and the Portuguese in the New World, as well as in Africa and Asia. The second piece that I would like to include in my discussion is Arthur Conan Doyle's short story The Crooked Man, which was initially published in the Strand magazine just as Conan Doyle's other Sherlock Holmes stories. The short story was published initially in 1893 and later included in the collection of stories entitled The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. In the narrative structure, it is in a way a miniature of the second Sherlock Holmes novel and story, namely The Sign of the Four. And elsewhere, I have also elaborated on my observations of the narrative structure of The Sign of the Four, of which the narrative levels represent the segregation of the urban space of London, the segregation of the geographical space of the British Empire, as well, and the segregation of the historical temporal, placing London, particularly West London or Westminster, as the center of the metropolis and the site of the absolute present. While the vicinity of the banks of the Thames, i.e., East London, is presented as the liminal border between the metropolis and the colonial peripheries, as well as serving as the point of entry for the colonial threats to enter the ordered civilized life of England, and it also serves as the site of the recent past. Colonial peripheries in the novel are in fact not set in the story per se, but rather presented through the second-hand narration of the criminal colonial returnee, narrating events that had occurred in the distant past. The returnee himself, bringing also the colonized silent subject to the metropolis, represents the fear of the empire taking revenge, and through the colonial returnee, the empire also speaks back. What I intend to argue by showing the layered structure is that the narrative is in a way a means by which the risks of colonial threats are managed, placing the colonial peripheries within a manageable distance from the metropolitan center, and thus the English imagination. The colonial is then connected by but separated from the center. This structure is replicated in the short story Crooked Man. The reason that I have chosen to include the short story in this presentation rather than the novel, The Sign of Four, is that the short story has actually made its way to the colonies and eventually into my hands in the form of a low Malay translation under the title Orang Bongkok by Tio E. Sui, published in the magazine Cerita Pilihan number 6 in 1924. What is interesting is that the translation shows modifications in the narrative structure as a kind of resistance towards metropolitan definition of colonial spaces, transforming the story by changing it from a narrative which represents the fear of contagion and colonial threat to that of a story presenting a series of events which shows the possibility of entering modernity by taking advantage of the West, but not dominated by it. Finally, at this point of history where the globalized world has been so immersed in our daily lives, Ali Smith's new novel, published just last year, Summer, appears in the midst of the pandemic as the final installment of the season's quartet. The story is narrated dominantly in the present tense so as to demonstrate the immediacy, urgency, and ultimately proximity of various events occurring in the world where the end and the resolution is not foreseeable. The novel told dominantly in the perspective of the generation born into the world where digital technology presents the global world almost without delay into the very private lives of its characters. As the world abundant information literally swarms onto the screens of phones and personal computers, much in the same way as viruses, both digital ones and microbiological ones, and social and even epistemological conventions collapse as they arrive onto the devices in fragments. While for 4 centuries Britain has been the center of a realm bound by its political and economic prowess, by this century Britain, as seen in the presentation of Brexit in Ali Smith's novel, Britain seems to have come to the ultimate point where it can no longer contain or manage its fears of both epidemiological and political economic contagion. On the other hand, the novel shows that the subsequent isolation also provides a contemplative space to evaluate and reconsider the course of the history of globalization, as if to replicate the narrative interiorization of the stream of consciousness in the early 20th century high modernism in the face of the global conflict that was the First World War and the Spanish flu as the predecessor of the coronavirus, which at this very moment looks us in the eye. That brings us to the end of my presentation. I would greatly appreciate any comments and criticism to this work in progress. Thank you.